Good morning, everyone, and welcome to how BC Stratas can get low carbon fuel credits for EV charging. My name is Wendy Wall, and I'm a board member with the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association. I'm joining you today from the ancestral territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, also known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. I want to acknowledge as well that we're grateful for the financial support of the province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions. The funding was used to spread the word about today's webinar. And some of you are probably wondering why I'm presenting this webinar. Well, I am a strata owner and a council member, just like many of you who are joining us today. You likely don't have a council member who is a transportation fuel expert. So today we'll cover and break down some regulations and processes in a way that laypersons can understand, with a focus on how they apply to strata corporations. So today we're going to cover the legislation. We're going to talk about which stratas are eligible for low carbon fuel credits, how the credits can benefit your strata. And then we'll get into some nitty-gritty reporting requirements. How do you receive the credits, monetizing them? Are you going to work with a third party, or are you going to go on your own and use what's called an LCFS Portal account? We're going to go into the new requirements for record keeping. And then at the end, we'll talk about, well, what can you do with the money under the Strata Property Act? So starting off with the legislation. One of the objectives of the Ministry of Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions, is to deliver programs and incentives that encourage us as British Columbians to choose greener homes, buildings, and transportation. So here today, in today's webinar, we're going to talk about transportation, or more specifically, EV charging in strata corporations. And I'll go into detail about this one incentive, which is called low carbon fuel credits. So in the transportation sector, as laypersons, we tend to think of fuel as being gasoline or diesel, but electricity is also fuel. So when we switch to electric vehicles, it contributes to BC's goals of reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. So the legislation in BC sets out the goals and the requirements to achieve this. On January 1st, 2024, the Low Carbon Fuels Act and two sets of regulations came into effect. They replaced some previous legislation and regulations, and together all of these pieces of law are known as the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. So rather than mention the individual act and regulations today, I'm just going to refer to them collectively as the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. So what does the Low Carbon Fuel Standard set out? Well, among other things, it sets out the requirements for suppliers of diesel and gasoline to reduce their average carbon intensity of their fuels every year. And the goal is to achieve a 30% reduction by 2030. Now that's compared to the 2010 levels. And the Low Carbon Fuel Standard also sets out the reporting requirements and some administrative penalties. So what's a supplier? The wording is a bit more detailed in the law because it includes suppliers, people who market fuel, people who are responsible through allocation agreements. You don't have to remember all of that, but for simplicity today, I'm just going to refer to them collectively as suppliers. Now, this is the part of the Low Carbon Fuel Standard that you want to know about. It sets out the eligibility for credits. So how are the credits calculated? And then the requirements for reporting those credits after they're traded. What you really want to know is, are you eligible for these credits? So to be eligible for credits, your strata corporation, or actually any building owner, like a co-op housing association, or if you're a landlord that owns purpose-built rental buildings, any of those entities, if you want to get these credits, you have to pass 3 tests. So we're going to go through these in detail, but just to summarize, you have to pass the test of who supplies the electricity to what they call final supply equipment. FSE. And that's just another way of saying charging stations. And the reason is because the stations are the final point. It's the final piece of equipment that electricity goes through to be provided to an electric vehicle. The second test is, can the electricity be measured accurately? And then the third test is, does the building have 5 or more dwelling units? So let's look at test number 1. Who supplies the electricity? Here, we're talking about electricity that's supplied to the charging stations by the Strata Corporation. So it's common electricity. That would be the Strata Corporation is the one who receives the bill from BC Hydro or Fortis, and then they pay it with funds from the operating fund. So the electricity is being supplied to the EV charging stations. We're not talking about the bill that goes from BC Hydro to an owner. We're talking about the common expense of the Strata Corporation. So if the answer to this question is yes, then we move on to test number 2. So can the electricity be measured accurately? The legislation requires that fuel suppliers register every single one of those charging stations and then report the total electrical consumption annually. So the Strata Corporation has to make sure it has a system that will ensure an accurate and reliable measurement of the quantity of electricity that's being provided to those stations. So some charging stations are capable of tracking that data, or you might have a network system that collects the data. The point is, it can't be an estimate or a guess. By law, it has to be accurate. And if you pass this test, then you go on to test number 3. And the test number 3 is, does the building have 5 or more dwelling units? So in the strata world, we tend to think of our strata corporations by the number of strata lots. But when we're looking at the requirements of the low carbon fuel standard, we have to consider how many residential units are in the buildings. And some of your stratas will have multiple buildings. So the Act calls them dwelling units. So if your entire strata has fewer than 5 dwelling units, then it's clear your strata doesn't, pass this test. It fails the test. But if you have 5 or more dwelling units in a single building, then your building passes the test. And if every residential building in your strata has 5 or more dwelling units, then again, the strata passes the test. So credits are not available for stratas that have EV charging that takes place at a building that contains fewer than 5 dwelling units. Now, sometimes a strata might have a common property parking lot, so it doesn't feel like it's really tied to a specific building. If you have a strata that has some buildings that have fewer than 5 dwelling units and some buildings that have more, it can be a bit confusing to know how to interpret this requirement. But to recap, if the EV charging is taking place at a residential building that contains 5 or more dwelling units, then the strata is the fuel supplier. However, the strata has to pass all of those 3 tests. So how can these credits benefit your strata? Now that you have an idea of whether your strata might qualify, we're going to think about this as a source of revenue, and all sources of revenue that the strata gets go to pay for your operating expenses. So this could be for insurance or for gardener or elevator. The idea here is that when your owners understand that there could be some revenue coming in from low carbon fuel credits, this is money that might help reduce their strata fees, and it might help increase contributions to your contingency reserve fund. So owners are going to be more likely to support projects to install EV charging infrastructure. You've heard the term EV ready. So that's one example of installing infrastructure. And if you haven't heard of EV ready, it means an electrical installation of everything that's needed up to the point of the parking stall, which means it's easier for each owner to get a charging station installed at the parking space. It's basically just being attached to a system that's already in place. So of course, there's a process under the Strata Property Act and bylaws, but this gives you an idea of how the credits could be motivators. So you all like the idea of a new revenue stream. So how many credits could you get? And how much are they worth? What's the value of a credit? You don't have to worry about how the credits are calculated. The formulas are complicated because they apply to all sorts of fuel like electricity, gas, hydrogen, even jet fuel. And they include a lot of complicated terms like carbon intensity, energy content, effectiveness ratio. You don't have to worry about any of that. The formulas are set in the regulations. They're set by law, and the government system automatically calculates the number of credits that a fuel supplier would get. So it's based on the amount of electricity that's being supplied to the charging stations. Let's look at some examples to see how those credits, how many credits the strata might reasonably get from supplying electricity to those stations. How much does the average driver actually use in terms of electricity? So according to Natural Resources Canada, drivers in BC typically drive about 13,000 kilometers a year. And depending on the make and model of their car and their driving habits, they use about 2,300 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. So if that driver is doing all of their charging at home and the strata supplied the electricity to that station, that equals roughly 2 credits per driver. The next question you want to know is how much is a credit worth? Well, the price fluctuates because the credits are traded in a credit market. And at the end of 2024, the prices dropped a bit in the market. So I'm showing the minimum. So the lowest amount of the trades in 2024 was $205 a credit, and the maximum was $512. So trading and transfers are usually pretty large volumes because you're dealing with large companies like oil and gas companies who are trying to buy these low carbon credits. Last year, the average trade was over 12,000 credits. However, about 25% of those transfers were under 1,000. So just keep that volume in mind since your strata will likely only have 4 or 10 or maybe 20 credits to sell. If we look at an example with a strata that has, say, 10 drivers, the strata could potentially earn about 20 credits that year. Based on the minimum price in 2024, that's about $4,100. But the trading price in 2024 ranged from $205 to $512. So you can see that these credits are worthwhile and they're worth pursuing if you're supplying electricity to EV charging stations. So there is a credit market report available on the ministry's webpage. It shows data from 2015 right up to the present, and you can see the trading prices broken down monthly, quarterly, and annually. So we're going to talk a bit about that later, about the credit market and trading in the credit market, because there could be fees involved, but it gives you an idea of the source of revenue for your strata. So now we're going to get into reporting and getting those credits. Getting money for your credits involves 2 main steps. First, there's the requirement to submit what they call a compliance report. So this is the key point in the legislation, is that someone needs to report the amount of electricity that's been supplied to charging stations because it's a low carbon transportation fuel. So once that has been submitted and the ministry has issued the credits, they have to be traded, which means they have to be sold on a credit market for your strata to get the money. So reporting is a legal requirement. The strata reports the total amount of electricity that's supplied to all the charging stations during a calendar year from January 1st to December 31st. And then you have to submit the compliance report by March 31st of the following year. So while submitting a report is a legal requirement, if you're a strata that just has a few EV drivers, and if you supplied less than 15,000 kilowatt hours during that year, you don't have to submit a compliance report. but then you wouldn't get any credits. So if your strata wants credits, you can work with a third party. However, if the strata supplies 15,000 kilowatt hours or more of electricity for those charging stations in a year, then a report has to be filed. Someone has to file it. Failure to report could result in administrative penalties. But why wouldn't you want to report? I mean, you want the strata to be eligible for the credits. So if you supply 15,000 kilowatt hours or more, you have two choices. You can either allocate the responsibility for the reporting and handling of the credits to a third party, or you can use what's called the LCFS Portal system, and we're going to talk about that shortly. So today I'm going to focus mostly on working with a third party through an allocation agreement. Since most of your stratas won't be supplying 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity yet, this is the area you're probably going to be most interested in. In this case, the strata would enter into an allocation agreement with a third party called an aggregator. And the aggregator can be any person or company in BC. And what the aggregator does is they pool the amount of electricity from many clients and they submit the compliance reports of more than 15,000 kilowatt hours. They submit a report, they get the credits from the ministry, and this works out to be a simplified process for small suppliers like strata corporations. Then the aggregator is going to sell the credits. They're going to record the sale in the ministry system, that LCFS portal system, and then they transfer those credits to a purchaser. The aggregator does all of this. And so the regulations require that the aggregator provide the information to the strata, but the regulations don't require the aggregator to pay the strata. So that's a contractual obligation that has to be set out in the agreement. So depending on the allocation agreement, the aggregator would be required to pay the strata. So what's an allocation agreement? Well, it makes another person or company responsible for your compliance obligations under the law. There's a lot of requirements under the regulations. So there's a base amount of work. And remember, there's administrative penalties. They're taking on the risk of those administrative penalties if it's not done right. There's no template for these agreements, so the format is going to vary, and they might include other services as well. They might need to read any contracts that the strata has relating to the EV charging stations. They might need information for the allocation agreement. So the regulations say what has to be in the allocation agreement. And I've just done a few bullet points here to keep it simple, but obviously it has to have the contact information for both of the parties to the contract. And in our case, it's going to be between the aggregator and the strata corporation. So the agreement needs to have the details of every charging station. There's a serial number and there's a longitude and a latitude of where that charging station is located. But your aggregator knows what information is needed and they can help you through that process. The regulation also says that the term of the contract can't be more than 3 years. There's also a requirement in the regulation that says the aggregator has to tell you how many credits they receive from the ministry and what the fair market value of those credits is on the day they were issued to the aggregator. So VASOA, Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association, we recommend that your strata council do its due diligence and have the agreement reviewed by a lawyer. So there are a list of questions that we came up with that you might want to ask an aggregator when you're trying to decide on a company. You could ask what support they offer to help you through the process. What information do they need? If you only have 1 or 2 charging stations, are they interested in you as a client? Do you have to be supplying a certain amount of electricity to those stations? Ask them if there's a setup fee. What's their sales commission rate? Does that rate vary depending on how many credits you have to sell. Is there a minimum charge if the market price of credits drops? Can they sell just a few credits? And how long does it take? Maybe they wait until the market price picks up, but maybe that takes half a year. Do they pay by check? What's the length of the term of the agreement? As I said, it can't be more than 3 years, but you might want to check the length. And can you renew at the end of the term? The other thing is that there's actually two programs, one in British Columbia and one that's federal. So you might want to ask if they provide a service for both of those types of credits. They are completely separate programs, but ask them, does your strata qualify for both? And do they handle those credits? So in BC, it's called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And for the Canadian ones, it's the Canada's Clean Fuel Regulations. So those credits are often just called the CFRs. Now, if your strata supplies a lot of electricity, you can do a process without an aggregator. This might be something to consider, especially over time as the number of EV drivers increases and the strata supplying more electricity. If the strata supplied more than 15,000 kilowatt hours, you have a choice. You can go on your own and report through the ministry's LCFS portal, or you can choose to allocate the responsibility to a third party, the aggregators that we were just talking about. So an LCFS portal is an online portal, and suppliers can log into their account. They can submit their compliance report every year, receive the credits from the ministry, and then after they finish selling the credits, the supplier comes back to the portal, they record the sale of the credits, and they transfer the credits to the purchaser's portal account. But just note the LCFS portal is not a system for selling your credits. It's only a system for recording the sale and the transfer. So you would still have to find a purchaser. And once you've sold them, you come back to the portal, you record the sale, you transfer the credits. But this could be difficult if you just have a small number of credits. So you might want to have a third party negotiate the sale for you. And just to give you some stats here, in 2024, 1.4 million credits were traded. They totaled over $603 million in value. The average price was about 277 if we looked at the last part of 2024. There were 116 transfers, and the average size of a transfer was 12,118 credits. But as I said earlier, some of the transfers last year were smaller than that. They were under 1,000 credits. So how do you get an LCFS account? There are two steps. The first thing you would need to do is get a BCEID for your strata corporation. It's a business BCEID account. And then you submit what's called a Form A. And what that is it's an LCFS portal registration form. So after the account is created, you'll be able to log in to the Stratas LCFS portal account. So note that if you enter into an allocation agreement with a third party, you do not need a BCEID and you do not need an LCFS account. Your aggregator is the one who has a BCEID and LCFS portal account. So there are lots of, there's forms and user guides on the ministry's renewable and low carbon fuel webpage. There's a user guide to help you set up your strata with a business BCEID, and there's a guide for using the LCFS portal. So here's what the login page for the LCFS portal looks like, and you can see that you log in with the BCEID. And then there's a dashboard and some information about your account. And there's a tab called Compliance Reporting. So you go there, you can see your past reports, you can create a new compliance report for the year, and it's for the electricity supplied from January 1st to December 31st. So for 2024, the report must be submitted by March 31st, 2025. So what activity are you reporting? This system is for many transportation fuel situations, such as companies that export fuel. So in this case, the activity that you're reporting is called the supply of fuel. You also have to submit some verification details, such as the FSE. That's, again, the final supply equipment, which are the charging stations. So it means identifying each charging station that the strata supplied electricity to during that particular compliance period. So for that, you can fill in the information by typing directly, or you can use the ministry's Excel spreadsheet. It's a template, and then you copy and paste all that charging information into the portal. If you have an allocation agreement, there's a section in the verification details to enter the information of who you have that agreement with. This is a section of the report called Supply of Fuel. So remember, the goal of the legislation is to reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. So you're reporting the type of fuel that you supplied was electricity, how much electricity was supplied, and the type of fuel it replaced, which was gasoline for light-duty motor vehicles. The system automatically calculates the reduction in the carbon intensity. Once it's filled in, you're going to save it, return to the compliance report page, and review the information. You're going to verify the report and click a submit button. So if the strata supplied more than 15,000 kilowatt hours during the compliance period, you have a choice. Do you want to get an LCFS portal account and submit the compliance report? Or do you want to allocate this responsibility to a third party? Your strata council and owners can discuss this. Decide what's the process you're going to use, who is going to be responsible for that process, and then be sure you don't miss the deadlines, not only for the reporting requirement, but also so you don't miss out on your credits. So there are some new requirements for record keeping. All organizations subject to the low carbon fuel standard have to maintain records, and the records have to be sufficient to verify the information that's in a compliance report, in an allocation agreement, and whether the strata is exempted. So let's break that down. Agreements with aggregators. So the strata is already required to keep copies of written contracts. That's in the Strata Property Act. But the low carbon fuel standard also requires this. You have to keep copies of the information that has been given to the ministry or aggregators, including transactional charge data. So we're going to cover more on that in a minute. The other thing is proof of exemption. So if your strata supplied less than 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity to the charging stations, it's exempt from that requirement to report, to submit a report, but you have to have proof. So keep your records of the electricity that was supplied to the stations so that you can prove that it was under the 15,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. So what is transactional charge data? Well, it's the information from each charging session. So it's the vehicle, which charging station it was charging at, when the charging occurred, how long the session was, and how much electricity was supplied. So here's an example of transactional charge data. So the vehicle started charging on February 1st, 2024 at 9:30 a.m. It finished at 3:32 in the afternoon. It charged for a total of 6 hours and 2 minutes. And during that time, 25.03 kilowatt hours of electricity was supplied to the vehicle. It's pretty detailed. So do you have this data? Well, it might be collected by the charging stations or the system. If you have a service provider or a payment processing service, they might have the data, or it might be in the cloud. If you're not sure, you can ask the contractor who installed the system. And if it doesn't collect this, then ask them, are there devices that could be added that could collect the information? So do download or obtain the transactional charge data every year. If you're working with an aggregator, give this detailed information to them when you provide the total electricity supply that you want them to report. But also save the data in the Stratas records. The ministry requires you to keep the data for at least 6 years and 3 months. So if it's data that relates to the compliance period in 2024, you have to keep it until at least March 31st, 2031. So it would just be easier as a best practice. I suggest keeping it for 7 or 8 years. So reading a meter or getting information from a hydro bill isn't sufficient because it doesn't say how much electricity was provided during each charging session. Now, the supply of electricity in the compliance report must only be electricity supplied to the electric vehicles. So it can't be electricity used for something else. So for example, some EV charging systems have computers or they have devices that consume electricity to operate the system. You can't report that electricity because it wasn't supplied to a vehicle. And you can't report electricity that was used for some other reason in your building. Again, you have to have the transactional data as proof. So if some of the data isn't available or it's missing, that electricity cannot be included in the compliance report. If you don't have the detailed data, you can't report the electricity, which means you can't get the credits. The person submitting the compliance report can submit the detailed data if they want to at the time that they submit the compliance report, or they can wait until it's requested. So the ministry staff, they might ask for the transactional charge data when they review the compliance report. And if you have an aggregator, then both you and the aggregator should be keeping the data in your records. So the Strata Corporation is a fuel supplier. It supplied common electricity to the charging stations. And now the Strata has received some money from the sale of the carbon credits. Great. What can you do with that? Well, the money belongs to the Strata Corporation. It's just like when the Strata collects fines or rents a parking stall or sells a key or a fob. That's all general revenue. So that means it's part of the pot of money that's used to pay all the Strata's operating expenses. So these are called common expenses, and they include things like insurance and utilities, gardening, strata management, janitorial services. So every year your council prepares a proposed budget to be voted on at your annual general meeting. It shows estimated revenue, estimated expenses, and the revenue section of the budget would have categories like strata fees, interest. It might have fines. It might have a category for something like renting parking stalls or renting a guest suite. I suggest adding a line for revenue for low carbon fuel credits if it's a year when you think some of them will be sold. So now keep in mind a budget is just an estimate. You could look at the credit market data report to see the selling prices last year, but you're not going to know exactly how much your credits are going to sell for this year. So that's okay. Like everything else in the budget, you just put in an estimated amount. Some strata owners think they have to reconcile exactly what's coming in from those credits against electricity that's been paid, but that's not the way a budget works. We have general revenue and we have operating expenses. So the year will end with a surplus or a deficit. And if you're in a surplus, you just look at the Strata Property Act. It says what the strata can do with a year-end operating surplus and what it must do to deal with a deficit. So now we come to the end. To learn more, check out BC's webpage called Renewable and Low Carbon Fuels. The webpage URL is really long, so I made a short one here. This is where you can find information, bulletins, forms, the user guides, and the credit market reports. You can also contact the Low Carbon Fuels branch by email. If you're interested in the federal program, you can look for information about Canada's clean fuel regulations or contact Environment and Climate Change Canada. The Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association has lots of resources, and you can also contact us at evcharging@visoa.bc.ca. On our website homepage, you can click EV charging, and that will take you to information about EV charging in stratas. Everything from how the Strata Property Act works when it comes to EV charging, to videos and guides. We have information about rebates for stratas and more. You can also find aggregators that work with stratas. Again, thank you to the province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions for their financial support in putting on this webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us today.